Good morning, everyone. My name is Diane Blacklane. I am co-chair of the Standing Committee on Finance, and this is my other co-chair, Stefan. So as you can see from our schedule, it's very tight. This for our first forum on climate finance. So we will be very efficient in the way we do things. Just to let you know that we understand that efficiency sometimes can come at the expense of knowledge and discussions, but we will have quite a few other opportunities for us to speak. We'll have lunch, we have breaks, we have different panel discussions, and as well as we'll get to know each other and we can speak to each other via email. This is our first in-person forum, but I would just like to say that we also have online a virtual forum, which is also very important. All the presentations made today will be available there. Our presenters only have 10 minutes, but their presentations are much longer than that, much more detailed, but you'll be able to get these presentations online. So don't panic, everything that you need will be there. Why are we here today? We have a climate problem. We have an environmental problem. And it is the view of the members of the Standing Committee on Finance, and in fact the view of most people in this room, that at the core of solving this problem is finance. Science has told us all we need to know about this problem, and they have also told us what our targets would be. The issue is that we're not spending enough money at the rate at which we need to spend it or invest it to meet these targets. The rate at which we're investing in mitigation is not at the rate at which it needs to be. So the Climate Change Convention has recognized that we need to do something about that. Stefan is going to tell you more about what it is that the convention is doing. But before he proceeds with that, I would just like to say thanks to a few persons who made this possible. We have Saeed is a member of the Standing Committee on Finance. Saeed is here in front, and he has a team of members from the committee that came together and pulled this together in a very short period. They made the agenda and they had discussions, and this is an amazing feat for negotiators. We are all negotiators on the committee, and we don't normally work this quickly. So this is a tremendous accomplishment. We have the World Bank, who has assisted us, and the representative is here, who has assisted us in pulling everything together. We have the Standing Committee on Finance itself, my co-chair, and the members, many of whom are here. So I hope you can get to know them so you can speak to them. Maybe they can stand, those members who are here, just stand so everybody can see you and mingle with you, tell you their ideas. Andrew, you're not standing. Andrew came from Australia. He's really jet-lagged. It took him a long time to get here. And of course, and last but not least, we'd like to thank the Secretariat, who really pulled this together in a very short period of time. And of course, we'd like thank all of you. We have a full room. We didn't think that we would be able to manage this, but we're happy that you're participating, and we welcome you here this morning. So what will be the Standing Committee on Finance role? We want to hear from you. How can we raise enough money from government, private sector, at all levels, the level of corporations, and all the way down to the grassroots level, to raise enough money and to mitigate at a pace and adapt at the pace demanded by science. The Standing Committee on Finance have decided that we have to look at the coherence of funding, the amount of funding, and the impact of that funding. We're also looking at the impact of funding that develops brown technology. That, to the rate of which that is growing as well, would impact on how successful we are. So Stefan, you want to talk about that?
Well, thank you, Diane, and good morning, everybody, and warm welcome also from my side. I don't want to extend this introductory remarks too long because we have a very dense schedule today. We're glad to have so many highly qualified presenters and panelists, but we also have a lot of expert people in the audience, and what the purpose of this forum is the interaction with you. So we want to make sure that we have sufficient time for the interaction, and as Diane said, The presentations will actually all be posted on the web, some probably in more detail than what will be presented here. The whole session will also be videoed and then posted on the web later. The web space, the virtual forum, which especially for younger people, is something very attractive, where you can post things, where you can see, look, study things. So we very much encourage you to look into that. Diane mentioned the Conference of the Parties under the UNFCCC. Now, some of you know that thing better than I do, but to some of you it may be a distant thing, somewhat detached from your daily business of investment decisions. The COP has actually realized, as Diane pointed out very nicely, that finance is in the middle of the thing. It's the lubricant that gets investments going, that gets action on climate change for mitigation and for adaptation. And it has decided on a number of institutional setups. That's what international bureaucratic regimes do. They create bodies, and hopefully those bodies are lively enough to pull the cart forward. One is the Green Climate Fund, which is still under construction in a way, hopes to be operational by the end of the year, beginning of next year. Big expectations. Another one is the Standing Committee on Climate Finance. We don't touch money, but we hope to influence the flow of money and the setups. Diane mentioned rationalization of climate finance, coherence, and coordination, because there's already a lot going on, and perhaps some gains could be found by having it in a more coherent way. So the Standing Committee, which moves to become a marching band and pulling things forward. Then we have the Adaptation Committee that looks specifically at adaptation issues, but also the finance aspects of it. This altogether makes it that we have more momentum, more brain power, and more action. And all of these committees will have to report back to the COP, and that puts us under a certain pressure to deliver something tangible. This forum we're particularly pleased to have, because it is a two-way communication that we want to engage in. It's the first one. It was put together under considerable time pressure, and there again, thank you to the World Bank Institute that helped, and thank you a lot to the colleagues from the Standing Committee, Syed in particular, that brought all sorts of input to the table, and to the Secretariat that made it possible, and the government of Spain that was also helpful, because you need some administrative things at the end too. With that, I would like to open the first session, and our first speaker is a member of the Standing Committee. He's also a minister of Nicaragua, but I let Paul Åquist briefly introduce himself. He has such a long and rich bio that would take up the 10 minutes for his speech, so he will have to refer to the short bio that will be posted on the web for the details. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. With regard to the bio, in previous life, I worked for the United Nations Development Program for enough years that they still send me a monthly check. And I studied political science and got a doctorate in that from the University of California, Berkeley. A 4 to 6 degree rise in average world temperature in this century is now the most probable scenario for planet Earth. The International Energy Agency posits that the current switch to natural gas alone will take us to 3.5 degrees as it displaces renewables in addition to coal and oil. It also warns that for every dollar not invested on renewables before 2020, a total of $4.30 will be required afterwards to confront a deteriorated future. For its part, the World Bank, in its report on how we can and must avoid a 4-degree world, posits that even the 4-degree scenario would be catastrophic. In contrast to the severity and velocity of climate change, we now live in a lost decade for climate change action and finance at the global level that began in Copenhagen with the attack on the Kyoto Protocol and that only survives today to provide a legal framework for the European carbon market. Kyoto, a legally binding agreement, is to be replaced by a Durban platform of ambiguous legal force to be negotiated by 2015 and enter into force after 2020. A goal, not commitment, of $100 billion per year for climate finance is posited to begin in 2020, contemplating both public and private sector funding and actors. This proposal is far too little, far too late, and far too amorphous. There is not a planning process or a roadmap to lend it credibility. We have only been told that it has nothing to do with the Green Climate Fund, which raises the question of from where financing will come for this fund without funds. The result of doing nothing is now visible. The 2-degree limit set for this century in 2009 is already a failure. The developed countries want to deal with the topic of climate finance, not in the United Nations, but in the framework of the G7, G8, and G20, with World Bank and the other IFIs as secretariat, thus excluding participation from poor developing countries. In none of our national societies would we accept that the richest and most powerful meet to make decisions that will affect all. So why should we accept this in the international sphere? Behind the irrationality and immorality of the lost decade, there is an even deeper malaise. A decline in our human civilization for over 30 years has been immobilized by subjective alienation and objective power structure. Weapons of mass destruction, climate change, recurring financial crises, persistent poverty gaps, and growing inequality between and within nations threaten a civilization incapable of effective action to overcome threats and adapt to changing conditions. The subjective alienations include short-termism, scientificism, and financialism. They consist of prioritizing short-term marginal gain over preventing long-term catastrophic loss, believing that science and technology can save us from all of the environmental damage we inflict, and prioritizing the equilibrium of financial systems over the equilibrium of the ecosystems that sustain life on Earth. With regard to the power structure, UNCTAD informs us that the proportion of total corporate profits received by the financial services sector was on average 6% in the 1980s. One might consider that a reasonable cost for their clients and the world economy for their services of financial intermediation and risk management. But that had reached 40% by 2007. Financial services itself had become a center for capital accumulation in the world economy. How? To answer in 2 words, deregulation and derivatives. Derivatives have reached a multiple, both in market value and nominal, of the real world economy. It's expressed in the graphs on the screen. The reason the politicians have not been able to control the bankers and speculators is because the bankers and speculators control the politicians. Behind the lost decade, the decline of our civilization, the alienations, and the power structure, there is an unsustainable model of production, consumption, and finance. However, there are alternative models. The lost decade at the global level has not impeded regional and national initiatives that mark the way forward. In the financial sphere, Chiang Mai +3, ALBA, and PetroCaribe are examples, as well as the multi- and bilateral commercial agreements and national currencies, including the virtual Sucre in the ALBA countries. These regional and national initiatives will eventually condition global action when they produce substantial changes in the patterns of world commerce. With regard to climate action in finance, I would like to cite the example of Nicaragua. Under the leadership of President Daniel Ortega Saavedra, Nicaragua is transforming its energy matrice from 25% renewable in 2007 to 90% renewable in 2020 through a mix of hydroelectric, geothermal, wind, biomass, and solar energy projects financed by over $2.9 billion in direct foreign investment from Brazil, the United States, Canada, Spain, other Central American countries, and Nicaragua. The energy matrice is increasing by 627 megawatts, 327 in hydro, 131 in geothermal, 84 from biomass, and 40 from wind projects, equivalent to 103% of our peak demand in 2012. And general rate generation will rise from 2.8 gigawatts in 2007 to over 5.2 thousand gigawatts in 2020, almost 2 times more. The investments consist of build, finance, operate, and transfer agreements, as well as proprietary projects. All projects must have a long-term contract with a private distributor with an ascending price scale. Access to energy is being expanded from 57% of the households in 2007 to 85% in 2016, with a national project being launched to reach the remaining 15% living in very isolated communities and farms with economically feasible, small-scale renewable energy. Nicaragua has been cited by Bloomberg, which has also been published by the Inter-American Development Bank, as the second country in Latin America and the Caribbean, only behind Brazil, in terms of renewable energy and the climate scope. These investments in energy are part of a $9.8 billion investment portfolio in a country that before 2007 had less than $300 million in investment per year. When Nicaragua reaches 90% renewable, it will save $1.9 billion between 2013 a year, 1.9 billion in that period, an average of $240 million a year in oil imports. And this will be part of the macroeconomic benefit of having shifted to our renewable energy. This investment portfolio does not include $40 billion for the interoceanic canal, which is currently in the feasibility study phase. The level of investment is made possible by a Nicaraguan model that combines the strengthening of basic capacities of the people, poverty and inequality reduction, macroeconomic stability and economic growth that has produced 1 million jobs, the lowest cost of living, and the best citizen security in Latin America. Simultaneously, overall debt has been reduced from 86% of GDP in 2007 to 56% currently. All of the foregoing has permitted a grand alliance of all social sectors, social cohesion, and positive investment climate. Nicaragua has initiated the process of overcoming the vicious circles that trap families in poverty and countries in underdevelopment, replacing them with virtuous circles of synergies. Countries that import petroleum to generate electricity might benefit from a Nicaraguan-type experience, even if they do not have the same degree of positive investment climate. Inasmuch as bringing renewables online reduces oil imports in the future, the cash flow to be generated in the future could be brought forward through trust funds that finance renewable energy projects against repayment derived from depositing part of the oil import savings in the trust fund until the projects are paid in full. Can Nicaragua and other poor developing countries, Nicaragua being the second poorest in Latin America and the Caribbean, resolve their climate finance needs? Yes, but only on the mitigation side, because they also have enormous and increasing climate change losses and adaptation needs. 1.9 billion in the case of Nicaragua for immediate priorities, according to the Economic Commission of Latin America and the Caribbean of the United Nations. However, there is no international initiative that facilitates adaptation finance for those countries that do their part on mitigation. There is also no needs criteria for adaptation finance, even for countries like Nicaragua, which is one of the most affected by climate change. Number 3 in the world, according to German Watch. These are the types of initiatives that would be truly useful and productive at the global level. Finally, we'd like to suggest that if the traditional forms of financing are not to be forthcoming, that the developed countries get out of the way and let alternative forms of finance develop, especially with regard to global public goods. In sum, if we don't mitigate, new adaptation needs will become greater. If we don't effectively adapt, our civilization will crumble. And without an effective response capacity, our existence will be threatened. Temperature has been the main conditioning factor in the expansion of the singularity, stellar nuclear synthesis, and the appearance and continued existence of life on Earth. We must not underestimate or play around with the ecosystemic impact of global warming. There is no higher priority for our species in 2013 than climate action and finance. To wait until 2020 and incur a full lost decade at the worst possible moment is simply unacceptable, irrational, and immoral. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul Åquist. Because Paul will have to leave pretty soon to go to the airport to a meeting that he was called to attend, we will slightly change the format and take 2 questions specifically on what Paul has spoken about, and then we continue with the program as planned and take questions and comments at the end. Yes, please. If you could introduce yourself.
Thank you. I'm Raymond Langveld from Suriname, also representing RULAC, together with Paul and the Standing Committee. Now, when he was making his... Thank you.
You're on.
Thank you. I always think I have a heavy voice, so I can speak in a room, but I see the room is big and people are in the back. I'm Raymond Landveld from Suriname, and I was just saying that I also represent the GRULAC together with Paul. And in his presentation, he was making a point about the descending price of energy. I'm interested in how that works, because in our case, the price is always increasing, so where that would be. The plan that he was presenting should have or has been started in 2012 to go to 2016. So it is also interesting to hear from him where they are in implementing that plan, and if there are bottlenecks, what the bottlenecks are. Because if we're talking about financing for climate, maybe some of the bottlenecks that Nicaragua is experiencing now in mobilizing that finance for the program that they already have for 2012 to 2016 is interesting for this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Raymond. Second question, and then perhaps Paul can answer. There's a gentleman back there, then Paul can answer both of them. I'm not sure if you're on.
Sorry.
Better.
So the question, I guess, and Paul's presentation maybe is the best place to open this, but I think it also was sort of raised in my mind during the open discussions when we talk about the amount, of finance that needs to be raised to and deployed to get anywhere near the targets. But the World Bank's report on 4 degrees and various other reports coming out show there's a huge disconnect between not only the finance that's flowing, but also the regulatory action that would drive that finance. And I guess and I think probably many others in this market are beginning to wonder whether that goes to the science. And the opening plenary said that we've got the science, we know what we're facing. But I actually don't think that the majority of people out there truly believe the science, trust the science, and really understand what the science means about the urgency to act. And until we deal with that and we actually go back to the science and ensure that it's communicated in a way that the majority of public and therefore politicians truly believe, everything that we do here around climate finance is going to be great, and we'll do a lot of good things, but we won't really fundamentally do enough to take us where we need to be. So I guess my question to Paul and the panel, and I think something to be borne in mind as we approach AR5 and Working Group 1 reporting in September, is how do we join the dots and ensure that that's effectively communicated so that we get the political will that will then drive the amount of finance that we actually need? Because I think we cannot ignore that fundamental issue around. So it's around communicating the climate science to drive the finance that we actually need.
Thank you. Paul, short replies to these two questions, please.
What was the second part of your question, Raymond? Oh, the plan. Okay, I got it. I remember it now. Okay, thank you. Well, with regard to the pricing, it's an ascending scale for the producers, the generators. They are receiving more every year. So across a 30-year period, their rate goes up, not down, just like you had mentioned. And that is absolutely necessary because Nicaragua has a mini devaluation process of 5% per year that everyone's accustomed to. And so there's these programmed mini devaluations every day across the year, taking out 5%. Now, the cost of energy, seen macroeconomically, goes down because we're shifting from thermal and importing oil, especially when it's at $100 a barrel or over, and fuel oil is also extremely high. We're shifting from that to Nicaraguan water, Nicaraguan wind, and Nicaraguan steam, and Nicaraguan biomass that's producing the energy. So the cost macroeconomically goes down, even we're paying the renewable producers more every year because we're replacing the oil imports. And it's that gap where this cash flow could be derived into trust funds to bring forward that savings to be able to finance renewable projects in developing countries and then have the repayment undertaken by the trust fund based on receiving the funds that would have gone for the oil imports. With regard to 2012 to 2016, that's our 5-year development plan. And our energy strategy now goes beyond our 5-year development plan. It also encompassed the 2007-2012 development plan. But within the really spirit of Raymond's question, all big projects take longer to execute than the engineers say they're going to take in the first place, especially in developing countries and especially in Nicaragua. So you hit a 253 megawatt dam for $1.2 billion, and it starts to miss its targets, and it stretches out to more years. So that's why we have a couple of those projects in that situation. So we're stretching out the period that's required to reach the 90%. The second question about regulatory activity, about consciousness, about the negation of living in the state of negation with regard to the science is very important. And I think that that comes back to something that I alluded to in the presentation, and that is that really we're living more of a political crisis than any other type of crisis, both in terms of finance and economics. This financial crisis that began in 2007 and 2008 was produced on the basis of political actions. There was the taking out of Glass-Steagall in the financial financial reforms of 1999. Then there was the Commodity Modernization Act of 2000, which legalized all of the derivatives, including naked credit default swaps, and stated they are not securities, they are not insurance, and they're not gaming, so that no one could control them. They were completely private contracts, and we get this boom in the derivatives, of which 90% are controlled by the 5 largest U.S. banks. So we're into real power relations here, and these relations relate to the political crisis. And I think the political crisis is visible when you look at political campaigns in different countries. The real issues are not even mentioned. The real issues confronting humanity are not even on the agenda. That is the depth of what our friend was alluding to in terms of the lack of consciousness and the lack of assimilation and the state of negation that a good part of our species is living with regard to the natural processes that surround us. Thank you very much. I'm very sorry that I have to run, but this was unforeseen. I was looking forward to spending the day with this interesting forum, and I wish you all great success, which of course is self-interested because I'm a member of the Standing Committee, and that's my success too. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, and have a safe journey on. The next presenter is Barbara Buchner from CPI. Please. Thank you, Paul. We're slightly behind time, but not too much, so I don't want to put pressure on you. We have no buffer, but we will manage to pick up.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting and important forum, and it's a pleasure for me being here. And just a quick note on who I am. I am running the European operations of Climate Policy Initiative, which is a research think tank. And a major part of our work really is focusing on climate finance, trying to understand what it is and how productive it's actually being spent and how we can learn from what we see at the moment and what we can learn from the variety of experience out there in order to really address the challenge and scale up the investments needed to address climate change. So I'm going to make a step back a little bit from the last presentation, and I'm going to try to show you to put a few key findings on the table of where we are currently in terms of climate finance and trying to learn the lessons from that in order to how we go actually towards the goals that we all have in front of us. So understanding how much and what type of climate finance is actually being provided to advance action on low-carbon, climate-resilient activities is essential. It's essential to ensure that governments and all investors out there have the knowledge and the tools to spend money in ways that optimize the prospects of getting us towards the global transitions, towards these low-carbon, climate-resilient futures. And for this reason, Climate Policy Initiative in 2011 has decided to provide a first overall overview of the climate finance landscape, trying to really quantify and identify the main dimensions and categories of climate finance and trying to show what are the key issues emerging and the gaps in also tracking climate finance, and finally also providing some of the remedies that could ensure that climate finance meets the requirements of being sufficient, transparent, and effective. The outcome of this initial work was our first climate finance landscape study in which we described to date in the most comprehensive way how money is actually currently flowing from the various sources, public and private, through the intermediaries that distribute the money, the instruments that are being applied to final end users. And we do that around our well-known spaghetti diagram. I'm not only labeled it like this because I'm based in Venice, so we do have a special relationship with spaghetti, but it's not only because of that, but it is because of how you will see in a second, the only slide I have, how actually this diagram looks like. So let me just put that up here. We did in 2012 then decide to update this study. And actually, no, I can't put it up there. I hope someone is going to help me. We decided to put up to update this study and going beyond building upon, but also going beyond the initial study, in particular in order to understand how we are doing against this overall challenge that science has identified. So what we want to understand is really going beyond the North-South focus, how much money is currently actually flowing globally, and we're trying to capture better the magnitude and nature of finance flowing also between and within countries. We're putting more emphasis on the different geographic recipients, on the different sectors that are out there, and we're putting more emphasis on this untangling some of the private finance flows, which we all know is important. So I'm not going to walk you through this, don't be scared, through this in detail. It is just to show you how we are thinking about this complexity of climate finance, where you can start from the very left side, where there you have the different types of sources that you have currently out there, the intermediaries that are then distributing the money, the instruments that are being applied to the final end users. And in a nutshell, what we find in this 2012 study is that currently $364 billion are on average being spent on low carbon climate resilient activities. I do want to stress that we should not confuse this number with the 100 billion that is identified in the Copenhagen Accord for multiple definitional and methodological issues. Most of all, this is not new and additional. This is everything which is out there. This is not necessarily private finance that has been mobilized by public finance. It's really to give you a snapshot of what is out there at the moment, what are the investments that are currently being made in order to address climate change in various sectors and areas. So let me just focus on two of the key findings of this study, and there will be more material on the website. The first key finding regards the relationship between public and private finance. So it's really the left part of this graph here, and I think the first thing you can see from me, even without being able to obviously read this graph, is this big red part of the diagram here. This red part is private sector finance. So this is showing you that the bulk of finance is currently being provided by the private sector. If we include private finance intermediaries, it's about 75% of the overall climate finance is currently being provided by the private sector. And we have about 2/3 of that coming from developed countries, but the study also reveals the real importance of the domestic private sector as a cornerstone in the overall climate finance flows that we can see out there. Nonetheless, the study also highlights the continued importance of public finance, public sector as a catalyst in private finance, but also providing bilateral aid to other developing countries and also reflecting actually lots of domestic governance support to structural changes in the energy systems, which are clearly engines of growth. So while we can see with countries struggling with fiscal constraints, we have seen in the last year actually an increase of domestic public spending towards these activities, and this may reflect the FASTAT finance pledges or the disbursements from some of the long tail of the economic stimulus packages that we've seen in several countries. A final point on that one, the overall figure on the headline figure on the private finance masks some of the important role of the public finance behind private finance. So what we've seen again is that about 50 billion of the overall finance that we would have previously labeled as private privately owned investments, is actually public finance standing behind private finance, which means it's like in terms of governments, direct or indirect shareholdings or lendings to private investment structures, and that is important. The second finding, which I want to stress, is the role of intermediaries. So it's this middle part of the diagram here. What we've seen is that public and private intermediaries actually raise and channel about 1/3 of the overall $364 billion US. And we consider this particularly, together with bilateral institutions, that it is national and sub-regional intermediaries which have intermediated about 2/3 of the overall part. And they are complemented by private commercial banks and by private infrastructure funds. But again, this ability of multilateral, bilateral, and national intermediaries to really build the low-carbon, climate-resilient economy is striking. There is a variety of financial services and tools that they can provide to directly bridge some of the critical funding gaps, to perform in areas that are underserved by the private actors, and also to implement some of the national strategies. And I do know that J.J. Gomez, who is in the room here, will talk about the role of national development banks a little bit more in a later session, so that's a really important function here. And so what does this all mean? Just let me come to kind of my final part of my remarks here. Again, we find that $364 billion are on average being spent in 2010, 2011, which should not, again, be confused with the 100 billion due to a number of reasons. But I do want to come back to the point that Diana made. While it's good news that money is flowing, and it's a start, we also all know that it's far short of what is needed in order to get us on the pathway to a low-carbon, climate-resilient future. And the International Energy Agency, for example, predicts that just to achieve the 2 degrees goal in the energy sector alone, you need about incremental investment of $1 trillion US dollars per year between 2012 and 2050. So this shows you that we have a major financing gap out there. And we've looked a lot into ways in how you can actually mobilize and unlock additional pools of capital. And just to finish here, I think what we see is that whatever type of investment, whether public or private, whenever green or low-carbon investments are actually deemed to be too risky or too costly, then the governments or investors are putting their money elsewhere. So the solution that we see and where we think we need to focus in the different forum deals with risk. So what we see is that risk seems to, whether it's real or whether it's perceived, seems to be the single most important factor that is impeding investments to finding the investors, so impeding green investment from finding investors. And we have categorized the green, kind of the risks which are usually being related to green investments, and we've tried to see what are available risk coverage mechanisms or instruments that are out there. And what we've seen in our work is there actually are a number of gaps that exist and which continue to impede money to flow into green investments. And the 2 most important gaps regard policy risks, which is really retroactive changes or rapid changes in policies. And the second one is related to financing risks, including access to capital and other types of financing risks. So we see that governments really have an opportunity, they have a window of opportunity to bridge this gap between the supply and the demand for risk. And they could do that through, for example, through the design of the Green Climate Fund, which could become kind of intermediary institution, which is specific niche on de-risking green investments. And really, in this way, governments could actually address one of the biggest barriers to green investments at the moment and really significantly scale up investments and get us slowly on the pathway that we need to be on in order to reach our goals. And with that, I'm going to finish here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you for, I like that graph, and I studied it many times, and I still don't understand all of it. But the figures, the big work that you and other people do on the research side to track the climate finance and related areas, and specifically, how does it play together the public funding and the private sector, and then you're at the core of the issues. How do you mobilize? How do you make the gap smaller between what is currently flowing, which is already considerable, and what is really needed to be transformational. If you have questions, please hold them. We will do then a question and answer session after the next presentation. Please give the floor to Mariana Williams from the South Center.
All right. So good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to the Standing Committee on Finance and to all of the Secretariat and everyone who's really been painstakingly and diligently working on this and facilitating my presentation here. I want to step back a little bit. For me, what I want to talk a little bit is about a development and equity perspective on climate finance. And I think there are three main points I want to make, and I will go to the document in a minute. One is with regard to the urgency of climate change and the need for climate finance that Paul spoke to, and also many of the questions related to. I think that there is a science, but there's also a serious issue of equity around really upscaling climate finance and mending the various gaps, some of which Barbara has spoken to and others which I'd like to add in. In addition to those gaps, there's the adaptation gap, there's a loss and damage gap, there's a whole host of gaps within the climate financing network that we need to look at. But I think the equity dimension is one. The other has to do with the estimations around the need and scale of climate finance. And I think when you look at some of the top-down and bottom-up estimations, you'll see that they come pretty close to what developing countries have been persistently arguing for since at least 2007 and maybe earlier, G77 in China, the Africa Group, and so forth. And then I want to talk a little bit about the developing countries' role in climate finance and what developing countries have been doing. So with regards, and then lastly, talk a little bit about where we want to go towards in the future. I think it's important that we recognize that climate finance is not just a technical or engineering aspect. It really is about moving money for funding adaptation, for funding loss and damage, and for funding mitigation that will make a difference and save the livelihood of millions of men, women, boys, and girls in the developing countries. We know that there are a growing number of natural disasters, rising losses of lives, and economic losses. So climate finance has a significant impact and importance for women's and men's lives, livelihood, economic and social empowerment in developing countries. And all of the top-down as well as bottom-up needs assessment and climate change impact studies from across many developing countries, even with all of the methodological issues, the issues of lack of rigorous definition of climate finance and a rigorous system of measurement, all point to the same realities. Dealing with climate change challenge will require trillions of dollars. Now, the convention has set in process a whole system of dealing with these. There are foundational principles. The money is supposed to be new, additional, predictable, adequate. And there are lots of issues about the specifics as to whether or not it should be primary public or whether or not it should be mainly grant and concessional. I think the convention also speaks to that. We have the first generation of UNFCCC climate fund under the Jeff Trust funds, the LDC funds, the special climate change funds. And all of these funds are existing, and in many cases, the funding channels into them have been very, very limited. So climate change financing really has the gender dimension in terms of equity, improving women's lives and empowerment. It has the intergenerational dimension, and it also has the development dimension, which is that in many developing countries, especially in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, there's an infrastructural deficit. And when climate events occur, the data shows that almost 70% of the impact is on infrastructure as well as loss of life compared to what happens in developed countries. So when we look, it's very important to look at what is the need and the scale of the financing in developing countries. And we'll see I think many people later on will be discussing some of the issues around the scale, but I just want to pinpoint a few. That if you look at the UNFCCC secretariats, even though it's been highly examined, that financial flow should be between 0.5 to 2% of global GDP in 2013 and 1.1 to 1.7% of global investment in 2013. The G77 in China, almost in 2008, argued that under the financing mechanism should be about 0.5% of the GNP of the Annex II countries. The Africa Group upped that in 2009 to argue for 5% of GDP. Other researchers, such as the South Center and the UN DESA, putting a number on the figure, have argued that that need is somewhere between 600 billion in the year 2020 and over 3 trillion in 2050. So there are a significant amount of the various aggregate and top-down studies that actually is coherent with the claims made by the developed countries. So what's the snapshot of past and current flows of climate finance? And I'll quickly go through it because we don't have a lot of time. So we see from looking at work done by World Bank, OECD, and others, that an average less than 10 billion per year totaled approximately 58.4 billion between 2005 and 2010, and which is about 10 to 15 billion per year. We had the 2010 to 2012 Fast Start Finance, approximately 28 to 30 billion. Most of the funds are concessional loans. Most of the funds go to mitigation. Only about 10% of this is distributed via the UNFCCC funding mechanism, and approximately 3.3 billion to the Jeff Trust Fund, the Special Climate Change Fund, and the LDC. In total, about 0.6 billion per year to these funds. The period 2013 to 2020 remains a blank. By 2020, we have the goal of mobilizing 100 billion. So that most of the funding has been going to mitigation, and even under mitigation, the OECD study shows that only about 14 to 21 billion have gone, and even that, you have to take out the CDM portion, you're still left with less than 20 billion going towards mitigation. Adaptation financing, which most developing countries depend on and need, especially in Africa and Asia, because of the urgency of climate change, is less than $1 billion, with about 100 to 3 million disbursed per year. So in summary, the flow of financing, despite the numbers and CPI puts out, when you look at what is the need in developing countries and what are the projects that are not being funded, the projects that have been submitted through the LDCF, through NAPAs, there is inadequate flow of fund, and there's the money that's actually going is arbitrary and fragmented and donor-driven, not driven by the needs of developing countries. So I think we have to have a little bit more carefulness about when we talk and we give these global figures, and I'm glad you qualified a lot of it, because when you look at the data, there's tremendous amount of needs in developing countries, and in fact, I think the OECD has said that you could judge the flow of financing by the way that it meets the needs. And regardless of how much money is said to be flowing, the fact is that in developing countries such as mine in Jamaica and others, we have a significant deficit of money for adaptation. Developing countries are actually coming out of pocket for climate financing because we have to deal with extreme events, the impact of extreme events. And that's not figured in to looking at the developing countries' contribution to climate change financing. So the way forward, and I know that I'm probably running over time here, there are two realities, I think, that we need to confront when we look at climate financing and the way forward. The urgency of the situation, that the longer we wait to take real significant action, the more the cost will rise in terms of losses of lives, livelihood, and the depletion and destruction of the inadequate infrastructure developing countries already have. These are infrastructures that need to be improved, to be built upon, and to end the adaptation and development deficit. Second, that climate change finance cannot be business as usual. And here I want to, for me and for most developing countries, I would say, climate finance is quite different from ODA. It is different from traditional development assistance. Traditional development assistance is something that developed countries do out of humanitarian concern, foreign policy concerns, or economic concern. Climate finance is a legal obligation, and it arises from the historical responsibility of developed countries for the stock of greenhouse gas. Almost 70% of the 30% of anthropogenic gas comes from the activities of developed countries who now have high income and infrastructure that allows them to be able to mitigate some of the climate change. Not all, as we saw in New York and Sandy, but the recovery rate is different, the loss of lives are different, and the loss of infrastructure can be quickly replete. So having benefited from the access of the resources, these countries now have the income, and they have an obligation that's not been imposed on them. It's an obligation that they signed to, voluntarily committed under the convention. Under Article 4 of the convention, if you go and look at it, the various agreements are made about agreeing to fund full cost, agreeing to fund adaptation, and the various mechanisms which we could go through, which I don't have time to go through. So climate finance is an obligation. In my framework, it's a legal obligation. It's not something you pick and choose. It's not a voluntary, it's a legal obligation. And if we believe in the rule of law, then developed countries, annexed to countries, must come forward and provide the financing as required. Third, there's need to work cooperatively and globally to transform the current approach to climate finance. A critical element of this transformative approach is to include the needs and perspective of those most affected by the climate financing decision. And I think most of the climate financing that's been done have not done that. It's been donor-driven, donor put money where they would like to. There's been not significant consultation either with developing countries or with the men and women, small businesses and communities in these countries, both at national level, regional level, and international level. And I think if we want to have a transformative approach to climate change, it's not simply about the private sector. It's also about consulting the people on the ground in the various communities to see what it is they need to be climate resilient, what are the indigenous technologies that can be upscaled, that can be built upon, and what kind of technology transfer and development that they would need to make them resilient and to help them adapt to climate change. We also need for parties to sit down and come up with rigorous definition of what new and additional financing. When you try to look at and assess the financing, it's bedeviled by the fact that everyone does what they choose and call it climate financing. We need a rigorous system. I find it really interesting that developed countries in particular are very, very careful about trying to build a rigorous MRV system for developing countries in terms of NAMA and all of the various things, but are resistant to building a rigorous system for measuring and assessing their obligations in climate finance. And that is the first step, I think, of good faith that needs to be taken, is that parties need to have a collaborative way of reaching this decision. We need to have an agreed benchmark that allows for rigorous differentiation of new funds and new finding. We need guidelines of criteria of what constitute and what are eligible for climate finance, especially to meet obligations under the convention. Yes, it's okay to have financing outside the convention, that's fine. But there is a convention, there is a legal document that has legal obligation that must be met, and that should be followed more rigorously. So we need more focused attention on sources of finance that do not have high incidence or burden on developing countries. We need a careful plan of how developed countries intend to realize the commitment to a goal of generating 100 billion. And I hope that as we go through the day and what the first slides show is that that $100 billion is woefully inadequate. It's not even a down payment. So let's be serious if we're talking about climate finance, meeting the needs and the urgency of maintaining 2 degrees or going to 4 degrees, as the World Bank and others have been saying. So this should include details regarding the mix of public finance and innovative finance. We also need guidelines and criteria for transparency on the remaining fast start finance that has flowed through the rest of this year, but more importantly, for medium and long-term finance. And we need a process that leads towards an agreement on the aggregate scale of financial resources for adaptation, mitigation, as well as loss and damage. We need criteria for allocation between adaptation, mitigation, regions and countries, and delivery mechanism. And I will stop there and then come back. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. We're a little bit behind schedule. But nevertheless, for this opening session that was kind of setting the scene and bringing in some fundamental also political issues, I do not want to cut out the question and answer and comment sessions. If the following panelists and speaker forgive me. So I will take a few questions. Please be as short and precise in asking and in answering. We start here. Then, okay, let me see how many questions we have. About 5. Okay, 1, 2, 3, then Paul, and you for the last one. Microphone, yes, please. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much. My question to Barbara. So thank you for your nice slide. Of course, it's not so easy to follow. But your key point is public-private finance, the role of public. That is really important. But my question is role of institutional investors. Institutional investors are handling the huge amount of financing, and they are looking at the new investment frontier. What is your view about the role of institutional investors? Sorry, my name is Takashongo at the Mitsui Institute.
Thank you. Should we, sometimes if you take 5, maybe we take 2 or 3 questions and perhaps we can bunch them together. The gentleman in row 4, please, and then you.
And good morning. My name is Ingo Pool. I work for Southport Carbon Asset Management. I'm based in Thailand. I have also a question for Barbara. In terms of the methodology for the spaghetti diagram, so money flows when incentive is provided, and a lot of the clean tech investment, let's say in power, is driven by a feed-in tariff incentive, right? That is usually paid by the ratepayers in the country. Let's say, when we talk about Chinese wind tariffs or like a adder system in Thailand, how do you account for incentives being provided, ultimately paid for by developing country consumers in your diagram? Thank you.
Okay, then a third one, and then we wait for the answers.
Yes, thank you. My name is Hisham from Egypt, Central Department of Climate Change. My question is about how we can push or make an incentives for the private sector to go through the climate finance. Is it something incentives or laws to push them or to get the climate finance, or it is still just idea? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's perhaps a question that both of you can answer. Start out with Barbara. On the yes.
So all very excellent questions. Actually, to the first one, the institutional investors, we do think that this is a really important pool of capital that we could at least tap partially. In the current landscape, they're only very marginally investing. This is why I said at the end, what we try to do is to understand how we can mobilize and unlock these types of capital pools that are currently at the sidelines of climate finance. And so in this context, I do think we need to better understand the way these investors work and the constraints they're in, both in terms of regulatory constraints like laws they're operating in, but also in terms of risks they are able and willing to take. And there comes the final point that I made, which I think is essential, that we really understand how to address risks that investors are actually not able to take, and how the public sector can come in this context to really create a kind of enabling environment where we then can unlock large pools of capital, including those of institutional investors. And there's a lot of good work ongoing also at the OECD and other institutions. And I think this is really something where certainly we will be focusing on also through case studies to understand how you can unlock that. But it's at the moment, it's still at the sidelines. It's a marginal part. I just want to then directly come to the third questions on this one, because I think it links back. I think really, if you want to incentivize the private sector, you need to understand how the private sector works. And again, already going under the private sector as one homogeneous group. I think we need to be aware that there is a wide heterogeneity of actors within the private sector with all different kind of circumstances, different types of incentives, different obligations that they have also in front of the money that they are investing. And so I think in this context, we just need to better understand how to address the different types of risks that they're not willing to take, and how we can make sure that the public money we spend is really only taking on the risks that the private sector wouldn't take on. In this way, you really could unlock and mobilize the private sector and make sure that the public money is being spent in the most effective way. And Ingo, on to your question, that's one of the issues we are struggling with a lot. We have improved our methodology over time. We're going now really like deal-by-deal transactions, so that's getting a little bit too technical. Maybe I'm happy to say more about that later, but we are going really deal-by-deal. We have this, for this reason, we have actually improved the representation of domestic flows in the countries, and we're actually, in the 2012 study, we've really highlighted the importance of households and corporate actors in this, also in developing countries. And I want to maybe just make this one point. What we saw is that from the overall global number, as you said, that we are actually showing about 30% is ending up in China, Brazil, and India. But about that, a major part of that is being raised and channeled actually domestically. So it's not like money coming from the north. So it's a very good point, and we're going to work a little bit more on that in the current update that we're doing.
Thank you. Mariama?
Just a couple of words. I think in terms of the institutional investor, they've got a lot of constraints around how they can play with the money that they have in their pot. But I think bond financing is a way that if groups of countries, especially Annex II countries, could actually launch a green climate fund bond, that would be a way to incentivize investors. But I think also dealing with some of the long-term, short-term issues and some of that investors also need to see that governments themselves are serious. And what we see is a lot of one step forward and many steps backward in terms of how governments, both Annex I and non-Annex I governments, are dealing with climate change. And I think once we see serious and significant movement that's continuous and forward momentum, that also will help to shift some of the psychology around looking at climate change and climate finance in a very serious. And I think it also holds for the first question the gentleman brought about the public consciousness. A public who sees governments who say that climate change is important and they do everything contrary to that and aren't making serious decisions aren't going to be trusting and moving forward. So I think it's the same thing for investors. They're not necessarily that different from the average person. I think in terms of how you incentivize private sector in developing countries, again, first of all, it's to recognize that they're heterogeneous. They're micro, MSC, they're women-owned, male-owned, they're ethnically owned, with different sets of challenges and constraints. And we need to go in, dig deep, and find out what those are and try to meet them. We also need to use tax credits and carbon tax and other tools. I think there's a tendency to stick to one or two big tools, but I think there are multiple levels of tools that can be utilized at the domestic level, domestic national banks and so forth, to help to move the private sector to do energy efficiency, to do climate resilience and so forth, that they can see that are beneficial to themselves, and also to protect and participate in adaptation issues.
Thank you, Mariama. We're, I think, about 20 minutes over. We started 10 minutes late, so we take 5 more minutes. The 3 questions, they were back there, then Paul, and then you in the front. Please. And thank you for being short in your answers.
Hello, my name is David Lunsford. I have a question for Barbara, also regarding the methodology behind your approach. I was surprised to see that a very small portion looks like is being delivered towards adaptation, and I'm wondering how you define adaptation, because I guess obviously the definition depends on the scale that you find. Where I'm coming from is that I tend to think of adaptation as environmental risk management. So anything from, say, seawalls in Norway to extending levees in New Orleans to maybe even the difference between the costs of the damage related to Fukushima and new energy sources in Japan. these could fall under adaptation depending on how you define it. So yeah, I'm just wondering, how do you define it, and have you, you know, what kind of projects might be contained in your financial flows that you found? Thanks.
Thank you. Paul?
Hello.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you. That was and thank you for those interesting perspectives on this issue in the opening. I think what we're trying to do, and the purpose of this forum, was to help the audience that's perhaps here for Carbon Expo, and much of which concerns itself with private sector financing for low carbon infrastructure, to help understand how what we do in the convention relates to what you do on the ground. And I think one perspective that was a little bit missing in the opening, although I know it's there in the rest of the program, is the private investment perspective. You know, we debate a lot in the convention about private versus public, and I think in the last year or two we've managed to move beyond a little bit some of these in-principle debates about which is more important or less important, which is a very helpful thing. But I know that when some of you heard the word equity, you might have been expecting a discussion about, you know, private equity perhaps, but just shows the fact that there's still these two worlds are still worlds apart. I just wanted to say that we had a very interesting debate about, in organizing this forum, about whether to use the word finance or whether to use the word investment to describe the activities, and you'll see in the title of the forum that we used both, so we always say finance and investment. And just listening to the opening comments, it's interesting because, you know, I think I regard all of the things we do, whether they're financed by public or private, as investments. They're investments in our future. They're also investments in other senses. Some of these investments can make a financial return, others do not, but they're all investments. And I think one important perspective that I just wanted to highlight, which we talk about in the Standing Committee and in the Convention, which didn't come out here so much, is that if we want to increase international flows to assist developing countries to mitigate and adapt, which is the central focus of the Standing Committee, then that's really a combination of how you can push money in to these countries, but also you have to think about how you pull money in. And it's a combination of these push and pull factors. And I think, Mariam, I was a little bit missing from your presentation that the focus cannot purely be on how you push money into an economy. You have to also think about how to attract both public and private flows. And I think when you look at the history of development finance and development aid, it's very obvious that countries can take, the countries that take effective action to attract public and private flows are often successful in doing that. And we can see that for climate finance in countries like India and others who've quite successfully mobilized a very large amount of foreign investment in low carbon infrastructure. So I hope that during the course of the day we can talk about some of these pull factors and some of these push factors. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. That was more of a comment, but a very nice comment to complement what I missed in the beginning. Please.
Yeah. My name is Nagaraj Rao. I'm from Bangalore, India. I represent CTIP FAN. We have been active in the private sector funding for the last 6 years. We have about $6 billion worth of projects across developing countries and have closed about $500 million worth of projects, over 32 projects. So some of the comment that I would like to share with the forum is that when we talk of private sector funding, we need to look critically at the country risk and the currency risk, which is the basic thing for us to look at the viability of the project. And in terms of when we say that we have got so much of funding, what is the incremental funding that we get year on year? Because obviously the cumulative numbers look attractive, but on an incremental basis, how does it look? Similarly, we need to put different buckets for public sector and private sector funding. Like Barbara said, there are some which private sector, by definition, cannot look at. And similarly, like if we look at the repayment track record, it has been quite a few years since money has been going this way. What is the success rate that we have in terms of repayment capabilities of these projects? Similarly, when we say funding for this, are we saying science would drive finance, or is it the business model from this that would attract the finance? So it's not the driving, but it is the attractiveness of the projects which will get the private funding. Similarly, what would be our perspective in terms of projects which are economically viable and at the same time are also viable environmentally and socially. And that is the one that would finally get funded. So therefore, what we all say as the triple bottom line. So with that, I would say that if we can give a perspective of the risks involved, incremental funding, and the repayment capabilities, and the domestic funding versus foreign funding because of the inherent risks, I think it would be more useful in analyzing the challenges in front of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think on the last topic, the next sessions will certainly also touch on that one. So perhaps we will hear some interesting ideas, and you can get back with your ideas on that one. Very briefly, the question of definition of adaptation.
Yes.
And then perhaps, Mariam, you want to answer on the push and pull.
Okay, yeah, adaptation finance. Well, I've tried to avoid that, as you've seen, because I've tried to focus on a few key findings. I think with adaptation finance, we have a major problem at the moment because of availability of data. I did not say that we base all of our work on existing databases or on like questionnaires with other, we plug into other tracking initiatives. We obviously depend very much on the OECD data, which is one of our key inputs. We look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance data. We look at all other types of tracking initiatives out there, and really bring together, make the data comparable, and then try to see how that actually looks in a bigger picture. So we do not so we use the OECD definitions on what we consider as climate finance, climate-specific finance. Again, a good point before that there is no internationally agreed definition, which certainly is one of the difficulties we're dealing with. But so we are taking the definitions from other organizations, and for this purpose, at the moment, we do have only very small, amount of adaptation funding. I usually don't even mention it because I do think that there is more out there in line with what you said. But we are basically depending on the real markers from the OECD DAX system and on some of the multinational development bank tracking initiatives that have started now to provide more data on adaptation finance. But I do think, so this is something we certainly know that there is still some research analytical effort which are needed in order to kind of harmonize at least the existing definitions a little bit more. But for us, what is important is that you're just very transparent in what you label and what is out there, and that you actually try to rely on the kind of tracking systems that are actually reputed very well. So this is the adaptation. I'm happy to give you some more details on the sidelines. I just want to make one point on what I forgot before on how to incentivize the private sector. And I think Paul's point was very important there, the push and pull factors. And I do think what I didn't say, the enabling environment in countries is critical to certainly incentivize the private sector as well.
Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, thanks. Really good. I think I want to just make one point on this adaptation issue, because I think there's a lot of myth and misconception around adaptation, and that since it's a central plank that's very important for many developing countries, it's something that we need to tackle seriously, and we need to maybe have some kind of study group or work group to look at it, and look at not only but the joint combination of adaptation, vulnerability, and resilience, because I think that, along with the deficit in infrastructure in developing countries, need to be tackled. And I think the extent to which you have adaptation, I would look at adaptation financing, is the extent to which it actually increases the ability of people to survive and to overcome after extreme events. So those are some of the things I would like to see in an adaptation methodological discussions. I think in terms of Paul's comments, which I take well, yes, there are push and pull factors. But for me, the primary thing that actually is the base for the push and pull with regards to climate financing in this context is the convention and the set of provisions that are there. Now, I think developing countries are doing a lot of pulling, right? They're borrowing for adaptation. They're paying co-financing for many of the adaptation projects. That's a lot of pulling, all right? Pulling in and pushing on their own. They're also paying out-of-pocket money for adaptation and for responding to extreme events. So developing countries, I don't think there are any developing countries who are not actually out front doing serious climate financing initiative with their own private sector internally around some of these issues. And so yes, the push and pull factors are important, but I think the push is very important from the point of view of recognizing what developing countries are doing. Also the pull. What I didn't get a chance to talk about was some of the work, and in my presentation on the web you will see some of the snapshot of what developing countries are doing. And Bangladesh, Indonesia, the Philippines has put out billions of dollars through borrowing of loan and so forth for adaptation. So yes, these two are there, and sometimes we tend to, I'm biased towards talking about what developing countries are doing. I think the private sector, yes, is important, but I think it has to be in the context of what will meet the needs of the majority of people in developing countries who suffer the most from extreme event. And the profit motive, yes, will get you so far, but it will not on its own take care of the very basic kinds of survival things that we need to take care of in the Caribbean and in other places. So we have to be quite balanced about what we look at as transformative elements. And that's why I say transformative element. Yes, one aspect would be doing more things to get the private sector involved. The other aspect is actually getting down to the community level, talking to the women, micro-enterprise, women households, women farmers, see what they're doing, what have been their historic and traditional reaction to dealing with things like crop resilience and so forth, upscaling those where they exist, complementing it with transfer of technology and so forth. And that, for me, is transformative, both those ends. From the developing countries' government, from the ground up, private sector, and everyone collaborating and thinking this through. And we need to start that with adaptation seriously and loss and damage. I know there's a loss and damage mechanism being proposed, but we haven't yet talked about how that will be funding. And that needs to be part of this climate finance discussion, because a mechanism without funding is not a mechanism that's going to do anything for developing countries.
Thank you, Maya. Thank you, Mariama. This was the opening session. You know, sometimes in the beginning we have a tendency to cover everything. There's more to come, more specific topics that we can drill deeper rather than getting larger. Apologies for not having stuck to the time schedule. We're a little bit behind, so bear with me that I wasn't the timekeeper I was supposed to be. With that, I would pass over to Syed. We'll make a quick change up here of the microphones. Please don't leave the rooms because the next session is on. Thank you for your engaged discussion, and thank you to the presenters.